So in the wake of the New Zealand shooting, Alexandria Ocasio Cortez has come out with her list of proposals for how to prevent shootings from happening in America. As you might expect, this list is entirely ideas about gun control, which has been a very popular topic amongst the Democrats for the last few years. I guess ever all the way back to Sandy Hook. Since then, they've really been trying to push it hard. And considering the level of prominence granted to AOC by the media, her proposal will probably have a great impact on the Democratic 2020 primary. As you all may remember, the Green New Deal that she proposed earlier was endorsed by most of the presidential candidates. It will be interesting to see if we see as many presidential candidates sign on to her gun ideas as we did with the Green New Deal. Because this is perhaps, well, it's hard to top the Green New Deal, but this is nearly as unworkable and nuts as the Green New Deal. Any one of her proposals would be considered pretty extreme by American standards, but all of them together is perhaps a recipe for dissolution of American society. It's just they're all non-starters, especially when put together for half the country, essentially. So her first one is a fairly common proposal: universal background checks. Now, what is a universal background check? As anyone here who has bought a gun would know, if you go to a gun store and you try and buy a gun, they're going to give you a background check. But if it's possible to obtain a gun without going through a background check, for example, if, say, you're 16 and your dad buys you a rifle, you didn't get a background check to go through that. Your dad got a background check if he bought it at a store, but then he gave it to you and you as the gift recipient didn't have to go through a background check. The same is true as if you sell a gun to your neighbor. If your neighbor's over at your house and he happens to look in the gun cabinet and go, "Oh, that's a nice shotgun," and you decide, "Hey, I'll give it to you for $150." Your neighbor didn't go through a background check either. So AOC's proposal is then to make people, every time they transfer ownership of a firearm, they would have to go through a background check. Now, of course, the fun part about this is that this is in effect a gun registry, because you would have to have guns registered with titles just like a car or a house. And so therefore, if you're doing a background check every time the ownership is transferred, the way that will be enforced is by issuing titles for guns, and then the government will know who owns which gun and where everybody lives, which would completely defeat the purpose of the Second Amendment, considering the purpose of the Second Amendment is for gun owners to act as a check on government tyranny. If the government knows where all the gun owners live, then they can just go disarm them in the middle of the night. And this is exactly why universal background checks have never been passed in the past. People go, "Oh, well, what's so bad about having background checks?" Well, it's not just background checks, because background checks already exist. Everyone goes through background checks. It's just you don't necessarily want the government to issue you a title for your weapon. You want it to just be a piece of metal existing out in the ether that they can't track. You don't want to track guns, because that would make it very difficult for you to resist the government in the case of some sort of plotting some kind of rebellion. So her next proposal was to confiscate guns from people convicted of misdemeanor domestic abuse. Now, she doesn't specify misdemeanor domestic abuse. She just says disarm domestic abusers. And I had to look twice at that, because I thought, well, if the guy's convicted of a felony, whether he's a domestic abuser or not, he's not allowed to own a gun under current law. So I had to look it up, and apparently there is a movement to disarm not only felons, but people convicted of misdemeanors. Of course, domestic abuse is just the start of that. I mean, once they disarm people who are domestic abusers convicted of misdemeanors, then I'm sure they'll find excuses to disarm people convicted of other misdemeanors. I mean, the only reason why they disarmed felons is just because nobody sticks up for felons, because felons are not a voting bloc. If felons can't vote, nobody's going to advocate on the part of the rights of felons. So you can do whatever you want to a felon. They're not people in American society. Quick sidebar for those of you outside the U.S. I'm not sure if it's like that in other countries, in Britain, France, Germany, South Africa, Australia. But in the United States, if you're convicted of a crime, you're pretty much unpersoned in this society. You can't get a job, you can't own a gun, you can't vote. You might as well move to a different country, because you'll have a lot more rights. But anyway, out of all of AOC's proposals, I think probably her whole gun confiscation from misdemeanor domestic abusers, that's probably the easiest one to pass, because again, nobody's going to defend that, because if you oppose that, then you're defending domestic abusers. So her next proposal was to mandate that guns are safely stored. Now, what that means is that we'd probably end up with laws somewhat like Canada, to where they make you keep your guns locked up to such an extent that they're not useful in any kind of self-defense situation. Remember a case in Canada a couple years ago where a guy used his gun in self-defense to fight off an intruder that was trying to murder him and his wife, and the police arrested him because they said there's no way that you could have gotten your gun out of the safe quick enough to defend yourself. You must have had it outside of the safe before the guy came in the door. And so here's this guy who just barely within an inch of his life was able to protect himself and his family, and the police arrest him because Canada is a nation of slaves. Their government does not treat them as equal human beings. And frankly, neither does the United States government, but we're at least a little better off than the Canadians. And this Canadian-style storage law is, again, a non-starter. It's not one of the most common gun control proposals, but it's something that as soon as it's explained to anyone, most people would oppose. Because people understand that the main reason why most Americans own a gun is to protect themselves. So her next proposal, this is a fun one, she wants to ban high-capacity magazines that, quote, were designed to kill people. Now, I'm not sure if everyone listening here is necessarily a big gun buff, but magazines don't kill people. People are killed if they're shot or stabbed with a bayonet, but I've never heard of someone being killed with a magazine. The magazine is just what holds your ammunition in the gun. Now, I'm going to give AOC the benefit of the doubt here and assume that what she was referring to were just 30-round magazines, because that's typically what Dems want to go after. The reason why they want to go after 30-round magazines, of course, is because those are the most common magazines in the United States. So if you ban 30-round mags, that'll give you an excuse to destroy the vast majority of magazines in the U.S. and drive up the price of magazines for rifles and make them more expensive to shoot for poorer people. And therefore less people will then own them and shoot them, and you'll be able to degrade gun culture that way. But the downside is, because they are the most common magazines in the United States, you were going to have significant pushback on that. Anyone who pretty much owns a rifle in 2019 owns 30-round magazines, and they're going to oppose a law banning them. So her last and juiciest proposal is to just, quote, ban semi-autos. Now, I'm not sure how familiar Sandy is with guns, but semi-autos make up the vast majority of all guns in the United States, so to ban semi-autos would essentially ban pretty much most guns. And certainly, it would ban all the guns that are used in any sort of practical self-defense application in 2019. There are very few people who still use revolvers for self-defense. Most people will use some sort of subcompact semi-auto gun like, a 380 or 9mm. Because those are slim and can fit, in a holster on your side of your body a little better. So I can assure you 100% that if she wanted to ban semi-autos, you would have pushback from anyone in the country who, one, owns a gun, because they probably own a semi-auto, and two, wants to own a gun in the future. So this is quite literally the most extreme policy you could ever push, because there is no Second Amendment if you don't have semi-autos, because that's pretty much all people buy these days. You can't have a Second Amendment without semi-autos. You can't even have the very weak, self-defense sort of condition, let alone defense against the U.S. government waging tyranny on the people. So all in all, I think AOC's proposals are going nowhere, but I hope they infect the Democratic primary, because I would love to see people up on stage at the debates trying to push each other further left on these issues and trying to embrace AOC's plan here. Because once they get to a general election, they'll either have to flip-flop completely, or they'll completely turn off anyone in any sort of outside of very urban areas. Of course, let's say that the Democrats actually won on this platform and somehow actually passed all of it. Wouldn't matter, because people would not obey these kinds of laws. They're just, you can't pass laws that don't reflect the society in which you're governing. It would be like outlawing vodka in Russia. People in any country only obey the law because they think the law is correct. They don't, if they think that a law is so egregious that nobody in the country really even thinks that it has any legitimacy, your law is not going to be followed. It's just like with prohibition in the United States of alcohol or marijuana or any of the other drugs. Alcohol prohibition didn't stop anybody from drinking. They just had to drink a different way. They had to make more moonshine and go to more speakeasies. But anyway, if you found this video at all interesting, I'd appreciate you giving it a like and clicking the subscribe button, because I do upload every day. And I'd like to see you all back here tomorrow.